Dr. Jeff Malins, when you went to college, did you ever imagine that you would be an AI scientist?
I did not. I mean, that was some time ago now. I went to college in 2003 to 2007 when I did my undergrad degree. So I'm not even sure, there was much discourse around that at the time.
Mhm.
And I'll say my father was a high school teacher and he taught computers and I sort of when I was younger I had this aversion to anything computer science. I didn't want to have to be in his class in high school and and I wanted to do something different. And so I sort of stayed away from that. And it was actually in graduate school that we were sort of required to take a course on programming.
Mhm.
And I was learned R and was doing analyses in R. And I happened to love programming and had no idea that that was like something I would enjoy doing. And it kind of really fit my problem solving nature. And we can sort of I'm sure we'll get into it a bit more, but my path kind of led me to looking for careers outside of academia that really called on the programming skills that I had at that point. And sort of working in AI was obviously a timely thing right now and really sort of called on those skills.
Absolutely. So then let's fast forward from your college days. Now you are done with your PhD and you are a professor at a university, right? At Georgia State University for 3 years, right? What changed for you?
So, I'm sure my experience was shared by many. The first year that I was a faculty member was the pandemic year. So, I was teaching. It was the very first semester I taught. Actually, was that spring 2020. About 6 weeks in, we then got moved online, and so there was the challenge of that, but there was also the challenge of I think with students that I really enjoy working with students, but it was really taxing that year. I think just all the challenges they were going through, and I was really taking that on and trying to be there for them, and there was just such a cost to it. So that was part of it. And of course, the pandemic didn't help with that. It combined with how drained I was, how busy I was. And so it was more that. It was more sort of the kind of life factors surrounding all of it and work life balance. And that's actually what led me to make the change.
Okay. So work-life balance and just being unhappy in where you were. You pivoted to a career in AI science. And I think this is, or being an AI scientist, not AI science necessarily, but being an AI scientist. And this is the part of it that always trips academics up, right? Is how do I actually make that jump? Because it seems impossible. The words I've heard from people is it seems impossible. It seems so difficult. I have to talk about my skills in a way that I've never talked about them before. How do I actually do this, right? And so, how did you do this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's a journey that I think takes a while. There's a lot of sort of identity work that happens around kind of that shift and sort of, considering yourself in a new way. And I think what helped me was that I had certain skills, as I'd mentioned, in sort of that programming area. And I understand for some that transition is more difficult than others. And it happened to be that the area I was in, that there was a real demand for people with those programming skills. And I worked in the area of neuroimaging. So I worked in like neuroimaging studies of language and especially in children, looking at areas of the brain involved in reading and language. And I was working in the area of neuroscience and education, which is more sort of thinking about how can we translate what we know about the brain to what's happening in the classroom. And there's a lot in that in terms of like how do we actually translate sort of these basic science findings and into sort of a more applied context. And I'd spent a lot of time in that space and sort of had developed the communication skills to be able to have the conversation, like with, let's say, classroom teachers, like, why do they care about, the inferior frontal gyrus of the brain and what's going on there? Like, how does that actually help me help this child in my class with reading? And so I'd kind of already developed some of those communication skills. And it happened to be that AI in healthcare is actually an area too where there's sort of this need for thinking about, okay, what's happening with these AI models? How do we actually explain that to patients, to care providers in a way that makes sense and allows patients to feel comfortable with sort of what's being done with their data and so there's just that those communication skills really go into it and I think that sort of in my journey what I realized that I actually had a lot of that what is really needed there to be able to do it.
So you already had those skills. And it seems like coming from neuroscience and having your programming skills helped a lot. Did you find that you had to, and we were chatting about this very briefly before we came on, did you have to change the structure of your resume, for instance, your CV, in order for it to make sense for this side of things?
For sure. Yeah, definitely I did. And that was a process, and I was helpful for, resources that folks like you have out there online, and I certainly made use of those. And, some colleagues of mine that are career counselors and things like that, and sort of, look through my materials and went through lots of edits and sort of got it to a state where I thought it was ready to start applying to things. But that did, yeah, take some work to sort of conceptualize my own skills and how to talk about them in a way that was going to really sort of be attractive to employers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what did the day in life look like for you?
Yeah, so one thing that I think one of the take homes that I've really had is that it's actually not that different from being in academia.
Mhm.
That I think there was this real sort of illusion that I had that it was going to look just vastly different outside, and I think depending on your job, it can. But what I do as a research scientist, it certainly there's a lot of sort of collecting data and processing it and cleaning it and analyzing it and writing code to be able to do that. I would say that about half my time is really spent with that, especially the programming in Python. But then the other half is, just being a scientist, like meeting with colleagues and discussing the work that we're doing, presenting our findings, scientific writing, which I'm highly involved with still, and I love it. I really thought I'd have to give that up when I left, and turns out that I didn't. And so that's been a relief for me that sort of the day looks pretty similar. I would say it looks more similar to when I was a postdoc. I think that's the closest time is where sort of you've got multiple projects on the go that are funded from different sources, and you've got to really manage your time between them and sort of figure out what the priority is for each week and all the different deadlines you have, that kind of thing. I mean, as a faculty member, it was a lot more about obviously the teaching, but also managing the lab and all the administrative stuff that comes with that, and applying for grants and being on committees. And that's not really what I do anymore.
Yeah.
So I would say it's more sort of strictly in the research side of things.
Yeah, on the research side of things. And I think the question that always comes to people, and I've actually had people ask me this too, is that if it's so similar to what we're doing in academia, why do they make it so hard to make the jump?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I've had that question too. And I think it's because the context, even though you may be doing the same activities, the context is always different. What I found working in, and you can comment on this as well, what I found working in industry is that every bit of activity I do has a business goal attached to it. So there's nothing I'm doing that's just like for the fun of it or for the discovery of it, right? It's not for those it just isn't, right? Everything has a business goal attached to it. And yes, there is some exploration. I'm not saying that exploration is completely canceled when you go into industry, but most of the time, 95% of the time, there is a business goal attached to that. And so the context is different, and the speed at which you may do things is also different. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that definitely resonates for me. I think that was part of what I needed to get used to the last couple of years is, certainly that in academia, it's a bit more self-guided. You have a bit more sort of input into the direction that you wish to go. If there's sort of a question you're really interested in, you can kind of go after it. And this is not that. I mean, it's sort of like I'm given a list of projects and tasks, and I don't have a lot of input into that. But on the flip side of that, I'm not worried about applying for grants and obtaining funding to do the work. It's sort of like I have that security, and I think better work-life balance as a result, because it's sort of like I leave my work and I'm not preoccupied at the end of the day or on weekends and things like that about how are we going to keep this all going. And I think that there's that's good for me, I think, to not have that preoccupation. But I also agree, yeah, the pace, because I work in a hospital and do research in healthcare, I think a lot of my colleagues are physicians, and there's this sense of urgency. Perhaps it's similar for you, where there's sort of being in something adjacent to medicine. There's sort of like people are used to doing things like very quickly, and I kind of have to remind myself sometimes that like okay, it's not like there's going to be like a data science emergency where like we need to come in on the weekend and like but it can seem like that sometimes where people want, our algorithms, they want them fast and, we want to sort of move to the next stage. And there, we also have business partnerships where, as you mentioned, there's sort of like, money on the line for like, our work and what we're doing. And there is that sense of urgency. And that's been something new to even sort of think about, sort of the market for the work that we're doing and how is it actually going to be used. And I mentioned that kind of translation aspect earlier. That's a space that I kind of like to be in. It's sort of like not just doing this sort of basic science but actually having an eye to like okay, where is this going to go, and like if we're developing some AI algorithm that clinicians aren't going to use, well then kind of why are we spending all these resources on that. And so it's really sort of having that feedback and working with the people who are actually in practice and what are their needs and kind of having that back and forth. And I think that just if you think about kind of the impact that your science can have, I think that like that's territory that kind of is important to navigate, to actually sort of have the impact that, at least for me, that excites me to be able to kind of be able to sort of make that leap.
Yeah. Which sort of bleeds into my next question was, what do you love about your job, right? And it sounds like you like to live at that intersection of really translating the research that we have into real life solutions. And this is where I think a lot of academics sit, because within academia, research can take decades before we ever see it in application. By which time, yes, it's still relevant, but most of society would have moved on. Sometimes, well, at least with the pharma industry, it's not always like that, because people still need a drug to cure a disease, and it's not so easy to get it through the FDA. So it takes decades. But it sounds to me like, and you can add on to like anything else you love about your job, like you love that space of, let's turn the insights that we've gathered from research into real life solutions that actually help patients now. I know you're enjoying this episode, and we're going to get right back to it. But I want to speak to you for a moment. If you're a student leader or university leader or professional organization leader, and you are responsible for working with consultants and speakers to educate, empower, and inspire your audiences. My name is Dr. Gertrude Nontra, and I've had the privilege of speaking at over 25 different institutions and professional organizations on career design, personal branding, as well as preparing for careers outside of academia, specifically with careers within the biosciences. If you need a speaker, I'm happy to come to your organization to speak either in person or virtually. If that's you, go to theboldphd.com/speaking to learn more, or you can simply email me at hello@theboldphd.com. Let's get back into the episode.
Yeah, I think for me, it scientific communication is something that I really care deeply about, and I think it's important to be able to make scientific knowledge accessible to wide audiences, and that's a skill, I think, to be able to sort of talk about, as I mentioned, sort of that communication piece of with patients and healthcare providers, or in education with teachers and parents and so on. And I happen to really enjoy reading like popular science books. I do that quite a lot, and I kind of marvel at the skills that some folks have to be able to really take these complex findings and talk about them in a way that makes it accessible. And so that's, I mentioned earlier about being able to write. I really love that's something that I still do, and am active in that. And that's one of the things I enjoy the most. And the other thing is also that, because of sort of living in this translation space and sort of thinking about communication and kind of being that bridge between different groups, I think it's sort of, there's some interpersonal skills and leadership in there, and I like to be situated in that space. I certainly really enjoy all the people that I work with, and so I think that's just kind of being part of that team, and knowing that you're contributing to sort of these larger goals. Like I I really like that. And I also like that, there's obviously a lot of discourse right now about AI and all its uses. And this is sort of a place where I think AI is really doing some good and can really help patients and help, detect disease early and save lives in some cases. And so to sort of be a part of that kind of initiative. And of course, that's why I was drawn to academia in the first place, is that, sort of being involved in research that can really make an impact on society. And so to be able to do that, that I think there are certainly other careers in data science where, you're doing all sorts of other activities that, it may not be as immediately clear what you're doing is going to have that impact on society. And sort of working in healthcare, it does have that very tangible outcome. And so I like sort of being in that kind of space. I think it's really rewarding for me.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say too is that the work life balance. I mentioned this a few times now, but I do think it's better. I really felt overstretched as a faculty member. And I think there are perhaps some folks are better at boundaries than other. I'm just not very good at it. I really struggled. I just was, saying yes to everything because I thought I should. And, I don't want to miss out on this opportunity. And especially when I sort of had a fledgling lab that I was trying to get off the ground. And I think now it's a lot more like, when I'm on vacation or even on a weekend or something, it's a lot easier for me to just kind of like turn off my brain and just enjoy my time and not feel like I should be doing more. And that's kind of led to some other benefits to me. So I am a painter as well. I can sort of claim that as another identity. And I've painted for many years, but when I was in academia, especially sort of postdoc faculty member, I just didn't paint. I just like didn't have the mental bandwidth to even be inspired to really do anything. But also, like any free time I had, I really thought, I better be working on a paper, or getting my lessons ready, or whatever it was. And I just didn't paint. And it was shortly after I embarked on this new career path, I started painting again, and I have been the last couple of years quite a lot, and that's been really just healing for me. And I love that that's back in my life now, and so that's sort of just a gift, I think, from being on this new career path.
That is so good. And it's so good because I have a similar experience that I hadn't really taken a real vacation until I actually well, I was laid off on my postdoc. So until I was laid off on my postdoc and found another path, I had never really taken a real vacation. And I remember the first time we took a vacation, I took a vacation with my family thinking, wow, like, and at this point, I'm like 36 or 37. That's like most of my life is like half of my life. I haven't taken a real vacation that most working adults take. And I just remember thinking, wow, so this is what it feels like to take a vacation. So the work-life balance, or some people say they don't like the word because like who's really balancing it all? But like that work-life integration really is a special thing that yeah. I mean, I didn't experience it a whole lot in academia. And for those in academia that are experiencing it, that's amazing that you're able to do that. But yeah, I agree with you that some of us maybe we have a little bit of people pleasing. And so and so the boundaries are not so easy sometimes for us. What do
Right.
you, right, yeah. Were you gonna say something on that?
Oh, yeah. I think that I read this somewhere recently. I can't remember where I read it, but just that there's sort of I think a distinction that's helpful between some people sort of are more okay with the boundaries being a bit more porous and
Yeah.
are perfectly, they like having the flexibility and, constructing their day as they see fit. And so they're happy to sort of, if I need to do a couple of hours of work in the evening, but that's allowed me to maybe do something during the day. And they don't mind sort of their work and non-work lives blending, and I would say I'm more in the case where I actually am okay with my workday sort of being well defined from the 8 to 5 or whatever it is, and then I actually even having a separate work computer from my personal one, like that, it makes a difference. Like I shut down that computer, I don't look at it again. And I think just having those very clear demarcations between work and not work, for me, that's really important.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Because I mean, I feel like life really is more than, not I feel like, I think life really is more than work, right? And so even you talking about your painting, that's, I mean, it just sounded so healing because it's like the thing I do when I'm not doing this other thing that, helps me pay the bills and fund my life, but I don't want to just like live my whole identity in that space, right? I want to also explore painting or writing or I don't know, jumping rope, whatever it is, right?
Right.
It's like being having the space to, because I think I don't know, I haven't read the statistics on this, but I know that a lot of people are stressed out from work, especially in the United States of America, where most people's identity is their work, right? And that's unfortunate. So being able to have that space to play, is really important to me. And so thank you, and thank you for sharing what you just shared. That's for some people that may not be the case and they're totally fine, but definitely I think you and I have that in common. What don't you like about your job?
Yeah, I'd say there's two things, and I think this kind of leads to, my own continuous inquiry about sort of like, where I might land next, and, kind of just like throughout this process, I think it's helpful to continue to consider, what works and what doesn't, and, you know, um, not to say that I'm just going to immediately, jump to the next thing. I think it's more just sort of a continuous process of inquiry about sort of the different steps. And one thing that I've really noticed is that what teaching in particular calls on is something I think it's just really sort of human connection in a real deep way. And, especially as I mentioned with the students I was working with during the pandemic, like I think just a lot of those, walls between personal and professional really left. And, I was really called on to be present for students and really help them with their lives and all the things they were navigating. And I really, it's so rewarding to me to I think, especially help young people and be there for them in that way. And, I think in this current job, I mentioned I'm part of a team and it's a really lovely team, but there's really not that sort of level of presence and connection in the same way. We sort of just really talk about the tasks we need to do, and we do those tasks, and there's some rewards and sort of cohering as a team and getting things done. But it's not the same as sort of like what I really got from teaching, and so I'll say that's sort of the one thing that I'm involved in some like volunteer mentorship programs and things like that to really kind of give back to students and be present in that way. The other thing is that I don't find it terribly creative. I think that like part of it is I also that I sort of moved into a new area. So I mentioned my background was in neuroimaging and I actually work in cardiovascular imaging now. That's sort of happened to be with the job that I have that. That's what I could find, and I've enjoyed learning about the heart, and it's been a new space and kind of a new challenge. But I don't necessarily know so much that I'm really able to like innovate in a way in this new field. I'm still sort of kind of learning what's being done and that kind of thing. And I mentioned the painting. I really like visual art. I think that I'm quite creative in that regard. And there's just really not as much space for that kind of thing in what I do. And that's part of why I seek out the painting, because I sort of want these creative spaces for myself. But that's something I grapple with, is like how much would I like creativity to be a part of my day job as opposed to sort of something I do after hours. And that's sort of, something I'm kind of still navigating.
Yeah, and I think it's a thing that all of us navigate. I also when I moved out of academia into when I first got my first science writing role, I find that I was mostly task oriented, right? Like I have tasks, my like you said, I had a great team. But it was very task oriented. So, hey, G, you need to write this ebook, you need to write this white paper. And so I just focused on that. I think, how long have you been in this role?
3 years.
3 years. Yeah. Because I'm just thinking about solutions to the creativity portion of it because I realize I think you're right on the path because when I now I'm able to be more creative with my work because I've been in the field for a while. I now know I moved into cell therapy, which was not exactly what I had done in my PhD and postdoc. So I think maybe it takes a bit of time. I mean, don't give up on it.
Yes.
I think it takes a little bit of time for that creative part of it to kick in. And it's not because it doesn't exist, it's just because we don't have the whole knowledge set just yet, I think. And at least in my case, I think that that's been what I found, right? Is that, and especially for somebody that maybe you, when you worked in academia, you were self-driven and you came up with projects, it can begin to feel boring. But then once you get to that place where you, for me at least, where now I'm very familiar with the space, um, it doesn't feel as task oriented. It feels like I can put a bit of my personality in it. Well, not necessarily my personality, but I can think up projects, right? Instead of waiting to be given tasks.
Right.
That's my
That's
thought
great to
on
hear. Yeah.
that.
And I'm glad to hear that. I think you're right on. I think that, I mean, the work that the group that I'm in is a innovation group.
Yeah,
It's in the title, and
yeah,
I think that they encourage us to do that. I think it's just I haven't quite, as you mentioned, sort of figured out how
yeah.
to do that yet. But I do think that will come, and there's support to be able to kind of contribute to the overall vision of what we're doing as a group. Obviously, it sort of needs to have the market research and all the stuff we talked about, kind of that this is actually going to, be worth the resources that we're going to expend on it. But I do think there's room there. It's just sort of me figuring out how to really tap into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. It's not an easy thing. See, it's very, I feel like it's quite amorphous, even what we're talking about, but eventually I feel like you find your groove. What's one insight from, let's say, as you reflect on your early career, as you reflect on your transition from working in academia to this space, what's one piece of advice you wish somebody would have given you?
Yeah, I think for me, I mentioned the identity shift, and that's really something that took
Mm,
me a while. And I mentioned I'm just kind of still navigating it really. That I'm a big advocate for therapy, and I've been doing that for years, and that's really helped. I think not just with this, but especially with the sort of the pandemic and all the kind of that surrounded it. It was a time of a lot of change, and for me, with the painting and things like that, of sort of having other aspects of my identity that I could really lean on when the job one was changing. So if I'm no longer a professor, I still am all these other things. And I think also just really being comfortable with the uncertainty that surrounds even professionally. So the job market is so unstable right now, and there's a lot of shifting going on, and so rather than sort of saying, I'm someone who does X or whatever that is like more like I'm someone who responds in an adaptable way to kind of the circumstances of my life and where I find myself, and I'm someone who's resilient, and kind of things like that really ground your identity, even if things are changing professionally. I think has been really helpful, and so I think for me that shift was difficult because I didn't have so much kind of other things that I'd really poured myself into outside of work. I was very sort of set on that academic path, and had really seen myself doing that, and had sort of defined success in that sort of one narrow way. And so that was something I think would have helped me a lot more if I had really broadened that sense of my own identity.
yeah. Mm. Sense of your own, and I like the word you use there, resilience. It's something I've been thinking about and reading about a lot, especially as it relates to careers. Like when you, because when any change, and I'm sure you as a neuroscientist and you psychologist too, right? Like psycho neuroscience, you know that any change in our lives does induce some stress, even if it's a low amount of it, right? Like moving countries, moving cities, changing jobs. There is stress involved. Having a child, like there is some level of stress that is involved. And I think sometimes a lot of us overlook that and just kind of try to speed past that. And of course, our bodies are like, no, 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 I'm not going to let you do that. And so the body responds, and you are wondering, why is my body responding this way? When in reality, you are going through maybe a low level of trauma, but you haven't acknowledged it, right? And so I really like that word And so being aware of that, this is one of the things, the conclusions I'm coming to in my reading, is that being aware of that can help you become more resilient. But because we are not always aware of it, we can easily get caught up in why am I feeling this way? Why is this so confusing? So I like that you brought up the word resilience. Something
Yeah.
I'm a lot around. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other term that I think is really helpful to name is grief. I think that some folks that I know that have left academia are really surprised by just how much grief there is, and even sort of the anticipatory grief that comes before people leave, even just sort of the thought of leaving and all that leads up to it. And I mentioned during the pandemic year, kind of all these challenges I had. Well, personally, also, I lost my mother that year. And that was a real challenge. And sort of, I was going through the grief of that while also going through this sort of career change grief and sort of noticing some of the parallels there in terms of kind of my response to it. And I think just kind of even naming it can be really helpful for people to be able to do that. But yeah, I certainly that resonates with me of having kind of sometimes just being surprised by like, what is this? Why am I still experiencing this? Or even now, several years out, still kind of having a certain experiences of grief that I'm surprised are kind of lingering when I thought like, okay, I'm just going to move on to my new life and that's going to be it, and that certainly hasn't been the case.
Every other Friday, I send out an email newsletter to about 3,000 PhDs and academics on tips, tools, and resources that you can use to build a career you love. And I'm inviting you to join us. You can go to theboldphd.com/careers list. Again, that's theboldphd.com/careers list. Let's get back into the episode. So this also comes, I feel like you keep leading to the next question, which is how have you talked about therapy, which is great, and I've also been through that. But how do you deal with the stress, well, with stress, and in your case, grief, right? You were navigating a career change, you lost your mom. Sorry to hear that. But you were moving, eventually you moved cities. It's a lot of changes, right? For somebody that is going through that right now, maybe they're finishing their PhD, they're having to move, they are starting a family. That's a lot of change. How have you handled that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's there's a lot there. I think that yeah, definitely therapy and also just community. I think that I've kind of sought out. There's a group in particular that I'm a part of called the Compassionate Cohort, and led by Catherine Lee and Jody Motter are leading that, and that's been a really helpful community for me, where it's sort of others that are also in this space of maybe thinking about leaving or have left, and kind of navigating that territory, and sort of being in community with others who are dealing with that has been really, really helpful for me. And even before I left, I definitely sort of sought out and talked to a lot of folks who had walked that path, and that was important to be able to kind of get that advice. And obviously, I mentioned the painting a lot, but I think there's a really healing power in anything creative like that, and that's been really helpful for me. And I'm also someone who is quite active, goes on a lot, runs and walks and workouts and all this. So that's been super helpful for me. And even kind of, I think even scientifically, I think there's sort of a lot when I go on a walk every day, and just the ideas that I have, and that really sort of allows me to kind of have that time to think creatively. That's really important to kind of have that consistency. And I'll say that I'm someone who thrives on routine. I kind of need it, and I try and keep it, as much as I can, something like that daily walk. I make sure that that's there, that I sort of build that in as best I can, even if sort of everything else is changing. Because I think it's, for me, it helps, regulate, to have those kind of consistent experiences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I feel like we talked about the psychosocial part of this. And I think it's a really important part of it because we sometimes talk about the mechanics of changing jobs and fixing your resume and networking and talking about your skills. But one of the things I've been trying to do is also dig into this side of things because we don't talk about it. And then you find yourself in therapy 5 years later and you're wondering why so this is a really important piece to it. But moving back to the technical side of things, for somebody right now who may be navigating this change and they want to do exactly what you're doing, what steps should they start taking to transition into a career in AI?
Yeah, I think there's a few things I'd probably say. I'm sort of, now that I've been in my position for 3 years, I'm sort of involved in hiring some of the new folks that we're a growing team. And, what I see that I think is really helps people prepare is when sort of, even if your current career maybe doesn't allow you the opportunity to actually work with data or do a project, there's a lot of data sets out there. There's a lot of publicly available, especially neuroimaging, but other areas as well, where there's data that you can access. And even if it's a small project, it doesn't have to be big in scope, but that you've done something that you can kind of point to really exercise those skills in data science. And my interview was involved an actual presentation of like a project that I'd done, and it, I think, really helps people to have those kind of concrete experiences that they can point to be like, here's what I did. It's impressive, I think, when people take the initiative to really go ahead and do something like that. And I think also just even giving a taste of what that looks like to have a project in a particular area and sort of carry it through and all the steps that come along. And certainly, I mentioned programming. Of course, that's important. I think that Python in particular, there's obviously a lot of my day is spent in that. And I think just having those sort of hard skills in programming are certainly important. But I also think that what gets overlooked sometimes is that the soft skills are really important too. And I mentioned scientific communication. I think that's one that's really critical, especially for an area like AI and healthcare, where you've got to, on the daily, I'm talking with clinicians and business leaders and folks who may not have the same vocabulary that I do, sort of working in the AI space, and talking about, okay, here's what we're doing, here's how we might innovate in this particular space. And I think that being savvy about that and sort of having the vocabulary and being able to write and present and these kind of things, and being able to bridge different audiences, I think there's that takes some training as well, I think, to really kind of practice and build those skills in those particular areas.
That's so good. So I like something you said about there being publicly available data sets that people could work with. In my sharing for people who want to come into scientific communications, I've always recommended that they have some kind of portfolio. Do you also recommend that people have some kind of portfolio? Like you say, you presented a project. Should people start working independently on data sets that are available to create a project of their own that they can put on their resume? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think that the candidates that I've seen that are really strong are people who've done things like that. And sometimes that can come from prior work, like maybe internships or those sorts of experiences that have allowed that. But as I mentioned, if not, then having a sort of a place you can point to be like, here's concrete work that I've done, and being able to demonstrate that. And some people will even go so far as like have their own GitHub page, or here's code that I wrote, and that kind of thing. If you're sort of more interested in kind of the programming analytics side. But I think even just having it, like, let's say posters that you've presented or other kinds of things where you've got sort of visual demonstrations of, here's work that I've done, and communication that I've done, sort of like I put this together, and because I think it really helps to kind of assess the sort of ability to translate those findings. And I think it's also just helpful, I think, even from we've sort of been talking about kind of like the going from the CV to resume kind of space, and contextualizing your skills and experiences in a way that's more shareable to potential employers who may not be sort of so acquainted with what all goes into a CV. I think having that, like, here's my personal website, here's all the things that I've done, which actual visual concrete things that people can look at and be like, here's data that I analyzed and a graph that I made, and the extent to which that's possible, I think that also helps, at least for me, that helps, like, kind of remind myself of the skills and experiences that I do have, that I can sort of share with others, and really build on that. I sort of, it may have actually been you that I remember reading this from before, but kind of having that personal website as a way of kind of documenting, and keeping track of sort of what you've done. And I think that not only helps others, but helps you too, kind of just remember that and be able to communicate it well.
Totally agree. And thank you for confirming something I've been saying for a while. But I totally agree with that because here's what I found about myself. I am my own unreliable witness. Like, you will forget things that you've done, right? And so sometimes I write things. I didn't know this before, but the reason why I recommend you have any academic having a personal website is that sometimes you've even forgotten things that you've actually done that are super impressive that could really fit into a particular job role, not just in data science, but in anything, right? And by keeping this recorded somewhere, it could even be, and maybe people are getting hung up on the fact that a website, so like people freak out over that. I'm like, okay, make it a Google sheet, right?
Right.
A shareable Google sheet, and just have links on the Google, like hyperlink everything on your Google sheet. And if somebody ever asks you, you're like, here's a Google sheet, literally. Or recently, what I did was put a lot of the assets I've written that I'm allowed to share in a Google Drive folder. And so when somebody asks me, and I made it sort of like you can share, it's shareable. So you
Right.
just share that link with people, and people can see your body of work, because a lot of us undersell ourselves, right? And having that personal website, like Jeff says, and having and like I like that you said that the more competitive candidates have usually worked on a project, but it doesn't have to be in the context of a paid experience or an internship. You could go do this yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that the communication piece is just so critical. I think that certain folks can really undersell themselves, and have done all these experiences in data science and have a lot of skills, but just aren't really able to communicate that well. And then then on the side of an interview, it's like, well, are they going to be able to speak with the clinicians and others, and have that dialogue, that I mentioned is so important. And I think that sort of, I think that can really get overlooked. I think people, especially in data science, can get like, oh, well, I need to practice my SQL, or, whatever it is, and to spend the time doing that, and sort of get worried about, and not to say that those skills aren't also important, but I think it's like sometimes just to instead take the time to, as you mentioned, sort of build that portfolio, have that sort of, what you can point to. And the other thing I'll say too is that, especially as a faculty member, I had all these experiences of, like, planning events, and being on committees and doing all these things where, that was kind of just like, that's just what you do. I mean, you just get tasked with something and be like, okay, I guess I'm, planning this conference now. And like, as you mentioned, it may not have been on my radar that much about, like, I'm more focused on these, what are my publications and whatever. And other kinds of things that actually are important, that really show that, I have certain skills, and just kind of, organization and leadership, and, other kinds of things that maybe I'm not thinking about so much when I'm reflecting back on my experiences as a scientist. And so I think, again, just having that there, and being able to call on it, and remind yourself of things that you've done is definitely important.
Absolutely, absolutely. This has been such a great conversation. One question I wanted to ask you was, how much do you think having a network helped you in making a transition?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and it's something I'm figuring out more now. I think that, like, I happen to be quite fortunate in the position that I landed, and as I mentioned, I think that the job market is a lot more competitive now than it was 3 years ago, and so I'm kind of realizing, and especially when I'm talking to others, just how critical that is, and I'm continuing to work on building my network. And LinkedIn is something that I'm using more now. I hadn't really a lot in the past, and for example, like I've been working with a career coach the last maybe year or so, and her name is Tori Waber, and she's fantastic, and really really helped me and professionally kind of be able to kind of own my narrative, I would say, and in terms of like I had a lot of maybe sort of imposter syndrome about kind of, can I claim that I'm an AI scientist when I don't have a background in AI or computer science? And, even just kind of like I felt it was so disjointed, like what I was doing before versus what I was doing now. Like, I was looking at language in children and now I work in a hospital looking at hearts, and like I was just like I couldn't bridge the two, and I was like I don't even know how to explain this. Like I just felt almost embarrassed about the choices that I'd made, and it felt random as opposed to like really taking ownership of the narrative, being like, no, there is some continuity here. And like, even, I opened our discussion with sort of that analogy between like the sort of working in the applied space between brain and education versus AI and healthcare. And I see those commonalities now. I certainly didn't at the time. And so that's really, working with her has helped me to do that. And one of the things that she encouraged me to do was to actually, if I was ready for it, kind of share on LinkedIn a little bit about what I'd done. And I did that. And I was just overwhelmed. It was the first post I'd ever made and had like, hundreds of likes and comments. And I got all sorts of messages and connection requests. And I was really overwhelmed by it. And I really didn't appreciate just the reach that kind of platform can have. And, as I mentioned, because I'm so, passionate about education and giving back and mentorship of students and others kind of navigating this space, that really meant a lot to me to be able to sort of still do that. And that's, part of why I kind of, wanted to have this conversation, is to continue to kind of be active in that space and really help people who may be struggling with this. And so I do think that, that community has been super important for me, and yeah, just to continue to have the conversation. I'm someone who thinks it's really important to kind of like be in that continuous inquiry. And as I mentioned, it doesn't mean I need to like up and leave my job tomorrow, but it's more just like, okay, what's working for me, what isn't? Are there ways I can tweak what I have going on here, or are there certain experiences that I might seek out, like the mentorship programs I mentioned, to be able to really exercise those skills that I want to be exercising? Because I think at the end of the day, it's more sort of about like, in my life, am I satisfied with like how I'm spending my time and what I'm doing? And I don't think it all has to be sort of like in my day job at work. And so I think just kind of having that larger community and building that and contributing to it, that's been really important for me.
And it is, and yes, shout out to Tori. I'm connected with Tori. She's famous in this world. So
Yeah.
yeah, shout out to her. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you for sharing that bit about that piece about networking, and I also appreciate the piece about even when you've made the transition and moved into your new role, right? It's okay to start thinking, okay, especially now that you're 3 years into it, what's my next move? What's the next step? And really actively thinking about that and taking steps towards that. I think it's all part of the journey. And thank you so much for sharing that. If people want to find you, Jeff, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I mean, LinkedIn, certainly, I'm active on there and happy to talk with people there. The other thing I didn't really mention yet, but I also I have built a personal website. It's jeffmalins.com, and what I've been doing is actually I've been working with another individual who's quite prominent in this space, Paulina Cosette, who I know you had on a recent episode. And she runs a course called Becoming an Academic Editor, and I took it, and it was fantastic. And I'm sort of curious about entrepreneurship, and that's also something that I think that might be my next step. And maybe it's something I kind of do on the side with my current job, and kind of see clients here and there. But I am really curious about sort of coaching people who are in academic, writing spaces, or maybe have made the switch to industry and are kind of navigating that, and kind of doing speaking events. I know you do a lot of those, and I'm curious about that too, and kind of just being in that space. And so the website I mentioned is one where I've sort of it's my fledgling kind of business venture where I'm sort of building that out and thinking about the types of services I might like to offer. But that's a space where I think that's really something I'm excited about.
That's exciting. I'm always excited about academics becoming entrepreneurs. So that's why I'm smiling so wide. But for those watching on the video, but yes, it's a really great space to be in. I think academics are poised to be entrepreneurs because we do have we our training is entrepreneurial. It's just it's in a very controlled space, right? But oh man, it's so amazing what would happen if so many academics would actually take some of those skills we've acquired, those innovative and entrepreneurial skills, and really bring it out into the world. So thank you for sharing that. Go to jeffmalins.com, check him out. You're also on LinkedIn, right?
Yes.
Yes, on LinkedIn. Go check him out. This was such a great conversation, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity and just to communicate with your listeners and happy to continue the conversation with folks who want to reach out.
Absolutely.